In the 11th century the population of Europe was divided by contemporaries into three classes: those who did the praying, the clergy; those who did the fighting, the nobles; and those who did the work, the common people. The last class, far more numerous than the other two combined, had no social or political importance and was despised. Its duty was to furnish the money, food, and clothing for the nobility and clergy. In the 12th and 13th centuries, however, its members began to obtain rights and to have some influence. Their progress may be studied to best advantage in France, where the advance was more rapid than in Germany or England, but not as rapid as in some parts of Italy or Spain. From the 11th century until the 14th, the population seems to have been increasing rapidly in all Western Europe, but it is not possible to give accurate figures as no census was taken. Most of the people were agricultural labourers. They were divided into various classes in each country according to the degree of subjection in which they were held. The slaves were mere property with no rights. They were few in number and almost always foreigners. Above them came the serfs, who held small farms, for which they were obliged to perform certain services. They were forbidden by law to leave their land, and were bought and sold as part of the estate on which they lived. Some serfs, especially those belonging to the church, were in a better position than others, but all were the property of their lord, who might be the king, a bishop, an abbot, or other member of the nobility. Above the serfs were the so-called freemen. The name is misleading, as they too were obliged to perform definite services for their lord, but these were not so heavy as those demanded of the lower class. Between the serfs and the freemen there were many gradations which were very important to the medieval peasants. Some had escaped from the obligations of serfdom without attaining the status of freemen. These were designated in the documents by technical terms which it is impossible to make clear. The same estate had frequently several classes of tenants, carefully distinguished because they owed different kinds of services and payments. The villages in which they lived consisted ordinarily of a single street with houses close together on each side. A little apart from the village stood the castle or manor house in which the lord or his representative lived, and the domain land, or portion of the manor, which the lord retained in his own possession to supply his family with food. There was usually a church with a cemetery at the back, and an open space in front. Such villages can still be seen in many parts of Germany, France, and Switzerland. Around the houses extended the fields which the peasants cultivated, and near by were the forests in which the lords hunted, as a large part of the land was still covered with woods. The houses were wretched hovels with only a single room, a single door, and no windows or chimney. Frequently the domestic animals and poultry were given the freedom of the house. The land which any labourer held was not all in one piece, but was scattered in narrow strips among similar strips held by the other peasants. Each year only 2/3 was cultivated. The other third was allowed to lie fallow. This was necessary, as men did not know how to enrich the soil, and consequently it was soon exhausted. Under ordinary conditions, the yield per acre was not more than 1/3 as much as at the present day. Wheat, rye, oats, and barley seem to have been the crops most commonly cultivated. Farm animals were small. Pigs, which secured their own living by ranging in the forests, furnished most of the meat consumed. Bees were kept in large numbers, as the expense was slight. Moreover, wax was in great demand for candles in the churches, and honey was an important food. There was very little trade, and each community had to produce almost everything that it needed. Grapes were raised for wine in parts of France, where it is not profitable to grow them at the present day. Each village had to cultivate herbs for use in sickness, and plants from which dyes could be made. In return for their land, the peasants had to make payments in money or produce, and to perform services. These varied according to the freedom of each class. The freeman usually paid fixed amounts at definite times, and worked on the domain land one or more days during the seasons of the year when labour was most needed. In theory, the serf could be taxed as heavily and made to work as much as the lord pleased. But in practice, his chief obligations were fixed by the custom in each fief. The lord, however, might at any time add new burdens, and the serfs could make no effective opposition. Even under favourable conditions, they usually had to work more than half the time for their superiors, and to make payments of various kinds. Whenever any extraordinary expense was incurred, they were compelled to furnish the money. In the wars, which were frequent, the peasants suffered the most severely. Their crops were destroyed and their villages burned. In times of peace, owing to their ignorance of agriculture, the crops often failed wholly or in part. Too much or too little rain, or heat and floods, were calamities against which it was impossible to guard. In a period of 73 years during the 11th century, there were 48 in which the crops in France were deficient. Whole districts suffered from famine, and because of the lack of communication between different parts of the same country, provisions might be abundant in one section, while people were starving in another. Pestilence followed famine and swept over the different countries with startling frequency. But no matter how hard the lot of the peasants was, they must make their payments. When their number was reduced by famine or pestilence, those who were left must pay more. How else could the lords live? The latter usually had no consideration for the peasants. Even if rabbits ate up their crops, no serf was allowed to kill one, because all game belonged to the lord. At times the misery of the serfs became so great that they revolted and killed their lords. This resulted almost always in their speedy defeat and punishment, for all the fighting class would make common cause against the peasants. More frequently they fled into the woods to become brigands, or else sought new homes, for in spite of the law, the serfs frequently left their land. The fear of losing his tenants whose services he needed was a great check upon the lord, and prevented him from imposing as many burdens as he might otherwise have done. The more enlightened tried to attract new tenants, and to keep those that they already had, by freeing them from some of the most burdensome obligations, especially by exchanging for a fixed payment the right to demand unlimited services. Lords who needed a large sum of money for a crusade or for some other unusual expense sold to their serfs the freedom from certain obligations. This custom spread because, to a certain extent, landholders had to bid against each other for labourers. Moreover, emancipation was looked upon as a pious act, and many lords, especially upon their deathbeds, freed a larger or smaller number. Serfs who became members of the clergy became free at the same time, and many rose to high positions. There are instances even of their becoming popes. By the beginning of the 13th century, the worst features of serfdom had disappeared almost everywhere in France, and in many parts there were no serfs at all. The lot of the peasants continued to be hard, but gradually they all became freemen. In most of the other countries, the serfs sooner or later obtained their freedom, and usually from the same general causes as in France. But in some countries their burdens were not removed altogether until the period of the French Revolution, or even later. The towns as well as the villages belonged to the nobles, and the inhabitants were their subjects. A town was an especially valuable piece of property, and could be sold or given away at the owner's pleasure. In fact, it was only a larger village which had fortifications and was governed by special laws. A city was technically the residence of a bishop, and belonged wholly or in part to the fief which he held. Sometimes a city or town was divided between two or more lords, each owning a part. The ownership was determined usually by the way in which the town had grown up. Some towns had existed from Roman times. Others had grown up about some centre, a castle or a monastery, which offered protection and also a market for goods. For the growth of towns was due wholly to commerce and manufacturing, although these terms sound grandiloquent when applied to the petty barter and home industries of the early Middle Ages. Sometimes during the invasions or private wars, a village erected fortifications and by favouring circumstances became a town. In such cases its rise was due to a favourable situation for commerce, to the security afforded by its walls, and lastly to the privileges granted by the lord who wished to profit by the added population. In other cases a town was deliberately founded by a lord in some part of his fief, by the offer of special privileges to any who would settle there. Because of their hardships, some of the peasants in the Middle Ages, especially in France, were constantly in motion, seeking to better their lot. Consequently, new settlements arose rapidly. Some still retain the name of Villeneuve, New Town, or Villefranche, Free Town. Within the towns and cities there were houses everywhere, even on the walls. The streets were narrow, crooked, and unpaved. The buildings were crowded closely together, and each story projected somewhat beyond the one below, so that the upper stories almost met and overhung the streets. Within, the homes of the richer merchants vied in comfort and luxury with the castles of the nobles. At the back there were gardens filled with flowers, and the best rooms opened upon these gardens. Each shopkeeper hung out his sign with some device representing his trade, for few could read. At dawn the shutters were taken down, and the streets were filled with people. Vendors of food and dealers in miscellaneous articles went about crying their wares. Fights between the apprentices of the different trades were frequent. Each industry had its own quarter, from which the workmen would sally forth to attack those of another quarter, or in which they would in turn barricade themselves. All day long the streets were the scenes of active life and varied tumult. At sunset the shops were closed. A little later the Angelus rang, and was followed by the curfew. Angelus. A bell rung as a signal for the saying of the prayers, which were known from the opening word as the Angelus. Curfew. The bell rung, usually at nightfall, as a signal to cover the fires, couvre-feu, and retire for the night. Back to main text. Soon after the last lights in the houses were extinguished, the watchman fastened the chains at the end of each street, and the town slept. Festivals were many, and were celebrated with a luxury which often surpassed the ostentation of the tournaments, for the French towns in the 12th and 13th centuries were very wealthy. The Crusades had given a great impetus to trade, and had put into active circulation the gold and silver which had been hoarded in the preceding centuries. The Crusaders in the Holy Land needed supplies and equipment from the West. Large vessels, built to carry men and supplies to Syria, brought back the rich commodities of the East. The men who returned had acquired new tastes, and desired luxuries with which they had become acquainted in Syria. The Mediterranean ports were centres of active trade between the Orient and Occident. From these ports the goods were carried mainly on the rivers, all over Western Europe. The towns along the Rhone and the Rhine, and on the sea-coast in Flanders, profited especially from this trade. In many places fairs were established under the protection of the nobles. These were centres for exchanging the products of different parts of the same country or of different countries. They were held for a few days at a fixed time each year under very strict regulations. The Lundi near Paris was one of the oldest and best known. It opened on the 11th of June and lasted a fortnight. Each town in France had a place assigned to it on the grounds, where the merchants could display their wares. At the fairs of Champagne, not only French merchants, but also Italian and Flemish carried on a brisk business. In England there were, in the 13th century, 50 or more places at which important fairs were held, The most noted were Winchester, Starbridge, St. Ives, and Boston. In order to carry on this active trade, the merchants required good roads on which they could travel unmolested and in safety. In the 10th and 11th centuries the roads were very bad, the bridges were few, and highwaymen were many. At the frontier of each fief it was necessary to pay for the privilege of entering or leaving. On the rivers tolls were heavy and robberies frequent. From the 12th to the 14th century conditions improved. The lords found it to their advantage to make better highways, to build bridges, and to police the routes, since for these services they could demand heavy payment from the merchants. These charges also became fixed and were no longer exacted at the pleasure of the lord. Thus travelling became comparatively safe and easy. The merchants were able to accomplish these reforms and also to gain influence in other matters by forming associations. The individual was weak, but a large number united made a body which even the feudal lord found formidable. The advantages of such associations were perceived very early, and in each town the merchants joined in a guild to regulate and monopolize trade, and to protect their common interests. These merchant guilds were able to obtain many privileges in exchange for money. Later the artisans in each industry banded together to form a craft guild, but the latter did not become very important until the 14th century. By their wealth and association the townsmen became powerful, and were able to obtain exemptions from many burdens. By usurpation or by purchase, or during periods of political strife, they secured one privilege after another, until they were almost, and in some cases entirely, self-governing communities. At first they had attempted revolts, but the early ones were crushed with great cruelty. When the Crusades began, many lords were glad to raise money by selling privileges to the towns. In such cases, sometimes a commune was formed, which was composed of a part of the inhabitants and acted as a single body, entering into a contract with the lord to pay a fixed amount in return for the rights which they desired. In other cases, a charter was sold to the town, guaranteeing its inhabitants against all illegal exactions, and granting to them certain privileges. During times of civil war, the support and wealth of the citizens were desired by both parties, who vied with each other in offering privileges. Those towns which were owned by two or more masters were especially fortunate, as the interests of the owners were often conflicting, and resulted in concessions from both parties to win the support of the inhabitants. In Germany and Italy, where the central governments were weak, some of the cities became entirely free and very powerful. Venice, Florence, Genoa, and Pisa obtained great possessions in different parts of the Mediterranean. Hamburg, Bremen, and Lübeck are still free cities, and constituent parts of the German Empire. In France and England, on the other hand, where the royal power was strong, the citizens obtained exemption from their burdens, but did not, as communities, become self-governing. In the 13th century, the wealthy merchants were no longer despised by the nobility. In the literature of the day they began to take a prominent place, and in fact a new literature, written especially for the citizens, began to appear. Individual merchants were appointed to office under Philip Augustus in France, and the advice of the citizens was often sought in enterprises for which their money would be needed. Early in the 14th century, both in France and in England, representative men were summoned to consult with the nobles and the clergy. From that time the parliaments were composed of members of the three estates, clergy, nobility, and commons.